Hello, my name is David Fletcher. I'm a statistician at the University of Otago in the Department of Maths and Statistics. And I've been working with ecologists for many years now, and I'm going to talk to you about a study I was involved in on a research project I've been working on for about 12 years. It concerns a project that was initiated by mutton birders, Maori from Rakiura, Stewart Island, who've been mutton birding for many, many years, were concerned that their harvests were declining and asked the university to initiate or help with the initiation of a research project to try to understand why this might be happening and to provide advice on sustainability of the harvests. The project is called Kia Mau Te Tītī Mo Ake Tono Atu, Keep the Tītī Forever, and the leader of that team is Henrik Moller, a zoologist at the university, and the study I'm going to talk about involved a student who was doing a master's degree at the time, Ilka Sörler, from Germany, and also involved help from Chris Robertson, a well-known seabird biologist. So my work was on helping with the statistical analysis, as it has been with a lot of the work in this project, helping design and analyse data collection, and also to help model the population to see if we can understand the dynamics of tītī, the mutton bird, or Sooty Shearwater, as it's called, and try to understand the dynamics in order to be able to assess the sustainability of the harvest. It's recently been discovered that tītī have one of the longest migration routes known on the planet, the longest recorded or known, and this graph or this map shows you the routes taken by a number of tītī as they migrate north during our winter and coming south again during our spring to start breeding on Stewart Island. Stewart Island is the main area, one of the main areas where they breed. There are islands further south called the Snares, and other places where they breed, but the main area of interest is Stewart Island, and particularly islands, what are called the tītī Islands around Stewart Island, where the mutton bird harvesting takes place. So you can see from that map that they travel very long distances during this migration. I think something like 60,000 kilometres on average was recorded for this. And so travelling through the Pacific Ocean on their migration, it's become evident that some of their dynamics, how well they do, can be linked to El Nino, the Southern Oscillation Index, and other climate effects that might be happening in the Pacific. A lot of this information was collected using transmitters that are attached to the birds, and of interest from this data is where the tītī rest and where they feed on this migration. That might lead to ideas about what ocean currents will be important for food sources, which fisheries might pose a threat. In the early 90s, there was a lot of problem with fishing in the North Pacific, drift net fishing, which has now been banned, that killed many of the tītī and lots of other seabirds during that period. So part of the challenge is trying to assess what's going on from these different sources and how they affect the birds. There you can see in this slide an adult tītī, weighs about 850 grams on average, and you can just see a transmitter attached to its back with the aerial sticking up there in front of the researcher's jacket. So that gives you an idea of what such a transmitter looks like. It's about 24 grams, or the ones we were using in this study weighed about 24 grams, which is a small fraction of the weight of an adult tītī, about 3%. But they dive quite a long way, about 60 metres. They can go down into the ocean to feed when they've landed on the ocean to rest and feed. And so that might have some effect on them when they're diving, or just generally while they're flying on them around the breeding grounds and coming back to feed chicks. Whether these transmitters affect the energy expenditure of the birds was quite important in this study. And so one of the main aims of the study I'm going to talk about is assessing the effect of such a transmitter on the attendance of the birds at the colony. Because during the breeding season, they are out, the adults are out feeding themselves and also getting food to bring back to the chicks. And this study was carried out in March and April, which is late in the breeding season. The birds head north in about May, with the chicks fledging about that time. And one of the main aims was to assess the potential effect of these transmitters on attendance of the adults at the colony. And in doing so, we used imitation transmitters that were essentially the same as a normal transmitter, except they didn't actually transmit, just to save on costs and be able to increase the sample size, but would have had the same kind of impact on the bird as a normal transmitter, as far as weight and drag in the water is concerned. The study was carried out at Tairoa Head, or Pukekura, at the end of Otago Peninsula, quite close to the university here. At the time, there were about 620 active burrows there, where the tītī live and still do live, thanks to efforts of controlling predators such as ferrets and so on. Quite near the famous albatross colony at Tairoa Head, just next door. And as I said, the study was carried out in the period March to April, over a period of about 6 weeks, late on in the breeding season. And the way ILCA attempted to assess attendance at the colony was to use a barricade made of toothpicks. So the burrows are in sort of reasonably sandy soil with tussocks around. And she put up a barricade of toothpicks just to see when they were knocked down to provide evidence of the birds, the adult birds, being in attendance. During this period, it would be unlikely that the chicks would be emerging from the burrows. So it's based on an assumption, as many research studies will be, that one always has to bear in mind that the knockdown of this barricade of toothpicks during a night meant that an adult bird had been attending the burrow, had been going out or returning from feeding to feed the chick. Once a knockdown was evident at a burrow, then ILCA used a special net that she'd devised to catch either one or both of the adults from the pair that were breeding in that burrow. And she was particularly careful to make sure the burrow had only one entrance. Sometimes the colonies can be quite complicated in that birds might have two front doors, so to speak, and she made sure that she was only looking at burrows that had one entrance. For those birds, they were randomly allocated to have either an imitation satellite transmitter attached, IST for short, or not. And she was aiming to keep these roughly even numbers as she went along through the 6 weeks, but trying to have as much randomness in the allocation as possible. And obviously the thing that she was trying to compare in terms of colony attendance was the proportion of times these burrows showed attendance by the toothpicks barricade being knocked down. There were other aspects to the study that I won't talk about in detail. She looked at the weights of adults, how those weights changed from day to day, whether that was influenced by the transmitters or not, and also the condition of the chicks, because you might have, if there was any impact of the transmitters on the colony attendance of the adults, then that might have some impact on condition of the chicks. So this slide shows the results in a full table format, all the results in terms of the burrows that were inspected for knockdown in a transmitter group and a no transmitter group. So on the left you can see the column with day number. That day 1 is fairly early in March, and there's a 6-week period. Down to day 41, and on day 1 there were 3 burrows showed no evidence of barricade knockdown for the transmitter group, and 2 burrows showed that one of those had evidence of a barricade knockdown. So quite small sample sizes on day 1. We're comparing a proportion knocked down in the transmitter group of 0, and obviously a proportion of 1/2 in the no transmitter group. Clearly one would like larger sample sizes than that, and as the study goes on, the number of burrows from which she had captured birds and put transmitters on or not increased. So we can see as we go down through the study, the number of burrows in the sample increases till it gets to 22 in each group at the end. So there's a sort of build-up of information as the sample size increases, and in the end we want to compare these proportions and see if there's any difference between the 2 groups, allowing for the uncertainty in those estimates. It's much easier to see the information when we put it on a graph. When in this slide you can see for the transmitter group, the proportion of burrows being attended, as far as we can tell from the knockdown of the barricades, is that there seems to be some kind of decline through that 6-week period. It is variable. As you can see, some of the points appear to be outliers, although that could be due, for example, on day 1 to a very small sample size, with 0 proportion on day 1 there. But the general picture, despite the variability, is that there is some downward trend in this proportion for that group. You can see here a simple linear regression line through those points indicates that there appears to be that kind of downward trend. The no transmitter group, shown here, seems that there isn't such a decline. It looks reasonably constant, although again highly variable from night to night. And one of the issues in ecology is this kind of variability in data, that it can be a little bit tricky to pick up patterns because there are other things affecting attendance of birds other than whether they have transmitters on or not. But the general impression is that there isn't much of a trend in that group, and a simple linear regression line through there shows a slight increase, if anything, in the proportion of burrows attended during that 6-week period. Possibly not statistically significant, but a slight increase there. Certainly the impression is that we have a difference between these 2 groups in terms of that pattern through the 6-week period. So if we go up, once again, just to have a look at the transmitter group, turns out there is clear evidence from this that those 2 trend lines differ. It appears there is an effect of these transmitters, has been an effect of these transmitters on the birds during this period, and that's nicely summarised by those 2 lines. Now, in the statistics courses we teach at Otago, we would emphasise that with data like this, which is binomial type data, where you're looking at the number of successes, so to speak, out of a number of trials, a success being a knockdown of a barricade, then the data themselves would we would expect would come from a binomial distribution, and it may be that simple linear regression wouldn't be appropriate for fitting a line to these data. It turns out if you do perform a regression which allows for the fact that the data come from a binomial distribution, then you get virtually the same lines as these anyway. So that more intricate analysis the kind that we teach at the university here, would allow for the fact that the sample sizes, for instance, are quite small at the beginning of the study compared to later on. So some of these points are a lot more precise than others in that they're based on much larger sample sizes. An alternative way of looking at the data is to actually directly compare the two groups on each of the 30 nights that Ilka collected data for. So we can see here a plot showing a difference in the proportion of burrows that were attended for the two groups. So the title to the graph shows that what we're looking at is a difference where we're taking the proportion of burrows attended in the transmitter group minus that same proportion in the no transmitter group. So anything above 0 indicates a higher proportion of attendance for the transmitter group. So the general impression is that in fact there appears to be some early on effect that suggests that the transmitter group were more likely to be attending their burrows, and that difference declines towards 0 and seems to go below 0 just about around days 25 to 30, and is another way of seeing the kind of decline we saw in the transmitter group attendance. In addition to the estimates, which are the diamonds there, we've got the confidence intervals, which help to illustrate the lack of precision early on. So they really help to illustrate that the sample sizes early on are not particularly large, so the confidence intervals are wider than later on in the study. And so, for instance, it's quite useful later on to be able to see that some of those estimates, whether they include 0 in the confidence interval or not, to see how clear the evidence is. So the conclusions that came out of the paper, the scientific paper that Ilka and I and others in the team wrote, was that it appeared there was a reduction in attendance by birds with the transmitters attached. So the slopes of those two lines we saw earlier on appeared to be statistically significantly different. There was reasonably clear evidence of a difference in attendance pattern here. And in addition, that it seemed to not change much amongst the birds without the transmitters. Some of the discussion of that led on to ideas about the birds perhaps needing to forage longer because of having the transmitter attached. And that, in turn, suggested that maybe some of the studies that try to estimate foraging distances covered by these birds might overestimate that because with the satellite transmitter on, they needed to take longer to feed. In addition, we assessed the effects on the chicks. There wasn't really any evidence of a difference, but unfortunately, as with many studies in ecology, it's possible that we didn't find clear evidence of a difference just due to a combination of high variability and sample size. And so I've put a note there saying that perhaps we had low power in those studies compared to the attendance results. Power is a term we use quite a lot to describe the precision or the ability of the study to discern effects over and above the inherent variability. There are similar results for other birds. Westland petrels, there was a study of a similar type carried out by other researchers that found similar sorts of results to ours. And I've mentioned this because it's typical of the fact that data from one study is often not enough to pick up general patterns in ecology, and it would be useful to have even more But in closing, I think it's worth summarising that one of the aims of this study was to assess the effects that our research might be having on the birds, because we were keen, as you can see from the map there in the final slide again, we were keen to see where these birds go, what they do, which climate effects might influence them, which fisheries might pose a threat. But in doing so, we wanted to also assess what effects measuring where they go could have on the birds.